circumstances where you send in ground troops, how are you thinking about that?
I don't even want to talk about it now. I don't think it's an appropriate question. You know, I'm not going to answer it. Could there be? Possibly, for very good reason. Have to be very good reason. And I would say if we ever did that, they would be so decimated that they wouldn't be able to fight at the ground level.
President Trump aboard Air Force One on Saturday, not ruling out the possibility of sending ground troops to Iran. We're going to have all the new developments and angles to the war now entering its second week, Joe.
Yeah, second week. And, of course, I don't think many presidents would tell people, telegraph where they were going to go as far as ground troops go. Still seems a bit of a stretch to suggest ground troops, given what we know so far. But, of course, with this president, it goes any direction he decides in the moment he thinks it should go. But there is no doubt a lot of people trying to figure out around his circle and also people who have voted for him how much longer this war is going to go. Many people believe it may last one more week. We shall see if that's the case. And the 2 weeks that he talked to me about a couple of Fridays ago would be the end of this coming week. We'll see what happens there. I will say right now, though, a very hot, apocalyptic looking war in the Middle East. Of course, the news reports that we're going to talk about this morning, Mika, a couple things happening with Iran picking the slain Ayatollah's son to be their new leader, and also oil fields being blown up, oil and gas storage facilities being blown up. So this is a war that it continues to expand. We'll see if there's an expansion with the purpose of ending it, declaring war, coming home in a week or so, or whether this is going to spiral even further out of control.
Well, with us, we have the co-host of our 9 a.m. hour, staff writer at The Atlantic, Jonathan Lemire, co-host of the Rest is Politics podcast, the BBC's Caddy K, and columnist and associate editor at The Washington Post, David Ignatius, is back with us this morning. Let's get right to it. The Iranian regime has selected, as Joe mentioned, the son of deceased supreme leader to succeed him. President Trump warned Iran on Saturday not to elevate anyone to the position who his administration hadn't approved. U.S. and Israeli officials have vowed that any successor will remain a target. Meanwhile, Axios reports that strikes carried out by Israel on Saturday on Iranian fuel depots were far broader than the United States expected. Two sources tell Axios the U.S. is concerned the attacks could backfire strategically by rallying ordinary Iranians around the regime and driving up oil prices. All of this comes as the U.S. and Israel continue to carry out airstrikes. On Saturday, Iran's president apologized to its neighbors for attacking them and said that Iranian forces would no longer strike nearby countries unless an attack originated from there. However, there continues to be reports of explosions in many of these countries. And Joe, certainly the Gulf states are, to say the least, quite angry. And I'm not sure saying we won't do it again is enough. They might need some more reassurance.
Well, I spoke to leaders in the region after that promise was made, and the response was, well, if that's the case, then why are the attacks still coming, which they were through the weekend? And, of course, much of that has to do with pushback that he received after making that statement from hardliners who do not want this country to back down. They do not want this terror state to back down. And David Ignatius, therein lies the rub. This is not Iraq. It's not take care of Saddam Hussein and at least the leadership scatters and then an insurgency begins. This is, as we've said, a deeply rooted terror state that has tentacles going back to 1979, and the idea that you blow up the supreme ruler, everybody else runs out and holds their hands up. That's not going to happen. So talk to that point. The resiliency thus far of this regime, and in part because they've been around since '79. And secondly, you're reporting the latest out of the region and the latest guesses from leaders on how long this war goes.
So, Joe, the regime is taking a pounding. The skies over Tehran now essentially are undefended, which means that U.S. and Israeli bombers have been able to hit targets at will. The exploding oil tanks that you mentioned in the beginning are just one example of that. A veteran Iran operations person I spoke with last night said that in looking at the situation now in Iran, you need to focus on the seen and the unseen. The seen is the decision by the Iranian leadership to install basically the most hardline person possible as the new supreme leader. It's a direct rebuff to President Trump and his talk about, I'll pick the next leader. Well, they picked somebody who is so close to the IRGC that my source said he's basically woven into the fabric of the IRGC. So this is going to be a hardline war leader, and that's the decision they made, decided to announce it publicly, even though the risk that he's going to be killed now, as his father was, is significant. What's unseen? What's unseen is any sign of revolt, marches in the streets, defection from the ruling elite in any part of the country. There is no uprising in Tehran or in any of the other provinces. People were expecting you'd see that kind of fragmentation by now, given the intensity of the U.S. bombardment. It isn't happening, which means that somebody like President Trump almost has to talk about use of ground troops because there's no indigenous revolt that's underway. Personally, I think the idea of invading with ground troops is so unlikely because of memories of Iraq and just the difficulties, Joe, of this is a country much bigger than Iraq, much more difficult to invade, more mountainous. So I tend to put the threat of ground troop invasion aside. But there's a real problem here on both sides of a tightening, no exit scenario. Neither side is talking about ways out at the very moment that the world economy is really beginning to hurt because of the effects of the blockade of the Strait of Hormuz and all the other war effects. We're heading toward, what, a week from now, I don't know whether we'll have peace, but we're going to have financial markets significantly tightened.
Yeah, and again, just based on everything I've heard, and also just looking at Donald Trump over the past 10 years, I find it it would be a break in his public character, I think, for this to go more than another week. With the oil prices spiking, understanding he doesn't want boots on the ground, understanding his absolute contempt for George W. Bush because of the Iraq War. I would just say, for me, if he goes past another week of this, and we're talking about this next Monday being a hot act of war, then I think all bets are off on whether Donald Trump does a Viking strike, as you say, pull back. Let's talk about three things that have happened, David, that is going to make it much harder, not only for Iran to rebuild if there is a new regime, but also much harder for the Iranians to see the United States as the so-called good guys. Number one, reporting not only from the New York Times, but other outlets, that it was a Tomahawk missile that hit that girls' school, killing up to 175 people there, mainly young girls. Of course, the strike, if you look at the overhead, they were going for a naval facility that was nearby. So the president can deny that it was the United States, but all the evidence suggests, strongly suggests otherwise. Also, the fuel depots being hit, good reason the U.S. would be concerned about that, and think even more damaging may be the water plants. The water plants that are, as you know better than any of us, it is not an economic lifeline. It is a lifeline to this region. Water is more precious and more scarce as far as living day to day than oil. And when those plants are being struck, you are putting yourself in a position to create a lot of hostility. Talk about these steps where either the United States or Israel are striking out against these civilian targets, and how the impact that might have moving forward, unless we, are far more careful.
Joe, from what we know, the first attack on the girls' school in the opening hours of the war was a tragedy of the sort that you see in wartime, a horrific moment, but not something intentional. Bombing these fuel depots and water desalination plants is intentional. We don't know yet who's doing the targeting, but it reminds me of a dispute that took place between the United States and Britain during World War II over what targets were appropriate. The Brits went after targets that had specific civilian value. It's called strategic bombing, whereas the U.S. tried to focus on military targets. When you go after water desalination plants, you're going after the population. And it was striking that Lindsey Graham, of all people, who's been very supportive of the war, had a post last night warning the Israelis to be careful in target selection. So take that for what you will. The problem with this kind of bombing is that rather than breaking the will of the public, it seems, from the history that we've all studied, to actually tighten their resolve. It makes them angry. It makes them more willing to fight on. And I think that's one of the problems. Surely in the Trump White House, people are beginning to think of the question, how do we end this war as the economic costs become more severe? Well, this kind of bombing that hits civilians makes it harder to end wars, not easier. So I hope in the discussions that's a factor that people will try to sort out.
I certainly hope so. And if it is at least with the fuel depot, Jonathan Lemire fuel depot, and the other plants, if it is the Israelis, it certainly let us hope that we can talk them off of civilian targets. It's the exact opposite of what we want if we expect the Iranian people to rise against this terror regime. But David Ignatius was warning beforehand. Just what he said right there. His concern about the United States having strikes on Iran was that after almost 50 years of this terror regime being in charge, it was exhausted. It was with Khomeini, it was likely on its last leg. And David warned beforehand that strikes actually would turn not only this regime into a group of martyrs, but also turn the Iranian people against the United States. We don't know whether that's the case or not. We certainly hope. I certainly hope it's not the case, because I'd like a democratic regime in there, though right now that seems unlikely. But there is no doubt that again, if this is the Israelis targeting water facilities and fuel depots for civilians, that's not doing anybody any favors.
No, and there's been no signs of the mass protests from earlier this year that were swiftly put down and sort of actually started this, made President Trump consider military strikes then, but U.S. facilities, our assets simply weren't in the region. And to that point, I mean, when David was talking there, we were showing footage of Tehran after that fuel depot was hit. I mean, these are apocalyptic scenes, the fire raging there across the sky. You're looking at it again now. And a few points. Yes, I'm told by advisors close to the president, ground troops not really an option. Some in the orbit are talking about maybe a limited incursion to try to secure fuel facilities, the nuclear facilities. But it's not a widespread invasion. That's not on the table, certainly at least not yet. We should note, by the way, the utter indifference by the Trump administration to the reports that Russia is helping Iran with targeting intelligence of U.S. military assets. And one Trump official after another, including the president, seems to dismiss that as if it's no big deal when, of course, it is. And Caddy, both Joe and David just hit a big point here about seemingly some growing rift between military objectives that Israel might have and the United States might have. Yes, if Senator Lindsey Graham is telling you you've gone too far when it comes to striking Iran, you know you've gone too far. We're seeing his tweet here because it is certainly the moral issue of also of hitting civilians, but also an economic one. And hitting these fuel depots combined with what we're seeing in the Strait of Hormuz, oil now over $100 a barrel. The market's really shaky. There's real economic concern as well.
Yeah, and speculation that oil could even go to $150 a barrel. There's a line that oil traders can see that. I think this is the week where the market's forces clash up against Donald Trump's own intentions here and his own desires to go big on this one. And he may find himself restrained just because the economic hit globally, but particularly to the United States, is too high. It's pretty quick when you start. We've had a week or so, perhaps people haven't had to fill their cars up with petrol, but this week will be the week people start going to the gas pumps and having to fill their cars up with gas, and they will start seeing already a rise in prices. That's going to put political pressure on the president to wrap this up. But what does wrapping this up this week look like if we have an Iranian regime that is just as hardline, if not more so, than the regime that was there before, where you had an aging Ayatollah who may well have died soon anyway? There could have been some kind of diplomatic or negotiated strategy. And now you have a country that is led by a hardliner, if he survives. Military supplies massively depleted. So I guess the president could paint that as a win to say, well, anything is better than what we had before. But I think we're going to have the lack of clarity about the strategy is going to hit us around the exit strategy, because it's harder to declare this as a victory when you don't know why you went in the first place.